welcome to this first panel of Electrifying Developments. Yeah, no, it's really exciting panel and really exciting to share research findings with you all and to hear what other people have been working on. I probably should start by saying that, I mean, the panel itself was sort of the product of this Future Dams research consortium that 4 of us are involved in. Barnaby, myself, Fana and Baruch, who will join later. Future Dams is an interdisciplinary research project looking at how to improve decision-making around dams and the water, energy, food, environment nexus. But then these papers that we'll present, 1 in this panel and a number of 3 in the next panel, are from the politics stream of research from the project, which looks at how politics shapes decisions around dams and electricity in Ghana and Ethiopia. If anyone's interested in more, have a look at the website, which will be on the links on at least some of the slides that comes afterwards, and also some of the working papers. But yeah, we're really interested in hearing both what you think of our research and to helping strengthening that, but also then interacting and sort of hearing what other people working on closely related issues are up to and getting insights from yourselves. So for now, yeah, there's 4 papers in this session. 15 minutes each, so we should have a decent amount of time for discussion at the end. And as I say, I'll try and send through a note through the text message function, giving you sort of 5-minute, 1-minute warnings. And so, yeah, I'll hand over to John and Lucy for her first paper on democratizing infrastructure.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm going to be presenting today mostly because I haven't been responsive enough to Lucy for us to do a proper collaborative presentation. So Lucy's here and has produced this work with me, and she's also here for the questions, and she's also here to dip in if she wants to give any concluding thoughts at the end, or correct me, or just tell me where I've really emphasized the wrong things entirely. But this is essentially a paper that is motivated by an assumption that we think is flawed, and that is that a decentralized renewable energy system might be more democratic than a centralized fossil fuel one or hydropower one, because citizens can be producers of energy. And so the title, Democratizing Infrastructure, ? Hints at this sort of common idea that infrastructure can be both an object and a subject of democratization. So not only can infrastructure be democratized, but infrastructure can democratize, and that's what we want to interrogate a little. So democracy is often invoked to secure better social outcomes, and we want to explore that relationship between infrastructure and democracy a bit more. And infrastructural analysis, that's where social relations are encoded and contested through material infrastructure. So piped water network in the south tends to serve areas where the wealthy have historically lived. Social power is expressed in that infrastructure. And if infrastructure can be democratized, then there are at least 2 potential pitfalls that we need to look out for. The first is technological determinism, where technologies determine outcomes. For example, that solar power could be more democratic than coal because of its inherent properties. And the second is spatial determinism. For example, that decentralized infrastructure might be more democratic than more centralized forms of infrastructure. And so this paper is interested in looking at those, what decentralized electricity generation can tell us about about this relationship. So some form of participation is important in pretty much every concept of democracy to affect how decisions are made or about how societies are organized. But material participation is a little bit less intuitive. It emphasizes how human engagement with things, with objects, features in governance. So as well as voting or consulting or protesting, participation can take a material form. So electricity generation by citizens or by businesses could be an example of material participation in the governance of an electricity system. And some of you might know Tim Mitchell's Carbon Democracy, which employs similar ideas. So he talks about how coal-based economy in the 19th century allowed workers to organize and to make political gains over industrial capitalists in in mines and factories, and that coal was an important part of that social process. And in contrast, the oil in the 20th century could not be, and this is a quote, readily assembled into a machine that enabled large numbers of people to exercise novel forms of political power. So Mitchell's analysis has been quite influential, particularly that idea of novel forms of political power around different technologies or resources. And so if fossil fuels can constitute different forms of democracy, then perhaps new technologies like solar PV could reconstitute those relationships between people and infrastructure in more democratic ways. Perhaps they could create novel forms of political power. So our infrastructural perspective then on energy democracy includes these contingent relationships between people and technologies within analysis of democratic governance and rule. And Johannesburg is our case study, but what is it a case study of? It's not a deliberative or institutional process of liberal democracy. So not our intuitive understanding of what democracy is, but it's a case of material participation. It's a case of businesses and citizens generating electricity, and in turn, how they are governed in doing so. So interviewees were with all the normal institutions of electricity governance, and with workshops with those same actors, a review of policy and planning and regulations, notably not the users and producers of electricity themselves. That would be another project, and which our research questions are not tailored for. So what can we learn about democracy and infrastructure from decentralized electricity? So highly simplified, this is a conventional electricity network from generation, transmission, distribution to consumers. The electricity flows one way. And in South Africa, this is configured under an enduring system of state ownership in which Eskom is a vertically integrated company responsible for most generation and transmission. And distribution is split between themselves and City Power in Johannesburg, but other municipalities elsewhere. And they sell electricity to their industrial, commercial and residential customers on the right there. So that's all subject to some change recently as well, but simple story for today. And the changing story is of bidirectional grids. So new generation, often but not exclusively solar, is embedded within the distribution grid. So consumers can become producers and hence the prosumer. And they're able to sell electricity to the distribution grid or to supply it to the distribution grid, and in principle to their neighbors too, depending on how it's configured. So you can think about some of these processes in the common way of understanding energy justice, very popular framework. Ask questions like who wins and who loses from this material participation. So you can install solar power if you have property, if you have capital, if you have other resources, and it is mostly businesses and to a lesser extent wealthy residents who are doing so. It's not the poor. So outcomes of that, those who invest reduce their demand from the grid supplies, so they pay less into a universal grid service, and everyone else needs to pay more in order to maintain that fixed asset. So cross-subsidization suffers if the wealthy extract themselves from the grid, meaning that embedded generation can result in exclusive spaces within universal networks that undermine redistribution and hence this distributional injustice. So Lucy and I wrote a paper about that. It's very interesting. Everybody should read it. It's listed on the screen. But there's something else I think we can investigate, which is the broader set of social relations that are affected by this form of material participation in energy governance. And I think that is important in looking at how people are governed and ruled through infrastructure. So these are the findings of the project now. The diagram shows how in South Africa and other countries as well, actually, electricity sales directly fund local government. So that's the left side of the screen. And that means if electricity revenues fall, then the whole municipal budget will shrink. So all public services suffer, not just electricity. And that means that local governments are having to think about how they're going to act differently. And we argue that they are adapting in entrepreneurial modes of urban governance. So first, they need to remain profitable while sales decline. So their business model is changing. And this is a change from commodity sales, i.e. selling kilowatt hours of electricity, to a commodity transport business, managing electricity trade over the distribution grid. And this is happening slowly and faster in some countries than others. But in South Africa, a quote from a manager talks about how I need to find income from the alternative means that customers are seeking to avoid my energy. This mantra of moving from volume to value. So they can talk about value, but essentially it's about rents from the existing network infrastructure. And a second is how the city actually finances itself. So if distributed solar power threatens their revenues, then another quote, municipalities need to find another cash cow. So how else can they do that? Local governments raise revenue. Well, interviewees suggested that they're involved in entrepreneurial activities elsewhere in the city. So rezoning land for property development, for example, or increasing urban density to collect higher property rates per unit area. So all very difficult, unpopular policies with the propertied urban classes, but similarly, an indication of the extent to which energy and urban fabric are entwined together really fundamentally. So putting these together, we argue with respect to distributive politics that material participation in electricity generation is extending the market functions of state institutions that we've been looking at. So these are importantly more than commercial logics. So they are commercial, they are entrepreneurial state activities, but they also aim to protect redistribution through that universal network infrastructure. And so more broadly, I think distributed electricity generation, this material form of participation, is affecting how state institutes govern, who they govern, and for whom, and their relationship to infrastructure in doing so. And the second set of relations we can look at is politics of production. So we can think about this prosumer as a new political subject of a material energy democracy. So remember that the prosumer is both the producer and the consumer of electricity in one. So there is an argument that they may gain some social power because they become owners of part of the means of energy production. So in doing so, they may be able to democratize the energy system. And Suzlecki draws parallels between these prosumers of today and Tim Mitchell's coal miners. So he writes that, like coal miners, increasing number of prosumers are not only independent from these energy oligopolies, but are interconnected and interdependent systems. So they become a vital component without which the system cannot work, and hence an indicator of the degree of an energy system's democratization. So I've highlighted interdependence here because I think that's where the politics lies. It's the governance of interdependence that means that this relationship between distributor and prosumer that is critical. So in that relationship, the company becomes the gatekeeper to the grid. They govern through the infrastructural connection. So along with regulators, they decide on the technology and the tariffs of grid connection, and they can either incentivize or disincentivize new prosumers by doing so. But in South Africa, we find that their arsenal to do so is surprisingly weak because businesses have been installing solar without any financial incentives to do so, because basically it offers energy security amid load shedding. And by disincentivizing legal installations, the municipalities would incentivize illegal connections, which would threaten grid stability. So if they don't embrace that technology, they risk undermining their grid and also losing customers entirely who may be able to go off-grid entirely if batteries become a viable technology for them. So they have to maintain that interdependence, and that's where the sort of site of governance is. So in repurposing themselves as the grid's gatekeepers, distribution companies don't need to own or control aspects of production. What they need to govern is exchange through the nodes and flows of a decentralized network. So through their material participation, prosumers are new subjects of energy governance. They may well become a vital component without which the system cannot work, but it's also quite possible to be integral to a system without having any power to influence it. And so we argue that it's important to understand how these new political subjects are actually incorporated into grid governance through socio-technical and political means. And I think this is important for democracy more broadly because it shapes what kind of political subjects prosumers will become and whether their ownership of infrastructure relates to any means of control or a redistribution or entrenching of infrastructural power. So concluding now, I think the paper emphasizes some things we already knew. The pitfalls of spatial or technological determinism, decentralized energy and infrastructure is not necessarily democratic or just, neither is renewable energy necessarily more democratic or more just. It also provides some novel insights, I think, into material democracy. So this is not democracy as decision-making shaped by all those affected, but democracy as a form of rule. And we argue that this case study reveals something of the relationship between infrastructure and democracy, because it's affecting democratic relations about who state institutions are accountable to, who gets governed through what infrastructure, and who exercises power through infrastructure and how. So on a related point, I think some of these questions have been taken up by STS in the past, and I think probably one of our contributions is to foreground questions of power to a much greater extent than they have been represented in STS to date. I know they would probably disagree with me about how to conceptualize power in that respect. And then I think we have this kind of relationship of democracy and infrastructure, which I set up at the beginning, which has this sort of scope for new technologies to reconstitute relationships between human and non-human nature in more or less democratic ways. And then similarly on the other side of the equation, this democratic lens on infrastructure that might complement ideas of justice and citizenship, but really emphasize questions like who owns and controls infrastructure and who and what gets governed by whom and how. So I think that's my time, and please do ask questions whenever you're invited to. We'd be happy to provide clarifications, conceptual or practical, and certainly to bring Lucy into the conversation too. Thanks very much.
Wonderful, thank you, and perfectly on time. I think it's probably better to, unless there's something particularly sort of clarificatory, I would encourage us to sort of leave the questions till the end. But yeah, so can I invite Abir Alariani on to present her paper on diffusion of energy access technologies in a conflict context.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. My name is Abhilash. I'm a PhD student at University of Sussex at SPRU. My research looks at the diffusion of renewable energy in a violent conflict context, and the case study is particularly the solar PV diffusion in Yemen. And this presentation is, I'll be presenting just a small part of my research where I try to map some of the key dynamics at the electricity sector since the start of the war. So before that, so my presentation is not moving. Do you see it move?
No.
Okay, it's moving.
There we go.
Right?
Yeah.
So I just give a quick background on the socioeconomic and political situation in the country before moving to the energy crisis, and then talk about the solar PV status. If we have enough time, then I might speak about the limitation and challenges of doing research in such context. So Yemen is a low-income country. GDP per capita in 2011 was $1,300. This went down to $774 in 2009. 47% of the population is under poverty line. This was in 2013. Obviously, this went up now to 75% of the population. Has the lowest electricity access in the MENA region. In 2014, electricity access rate was 45%, which was also unequally distributed between urban and rural households. This again went to, right now is like between 10 to 30% of the population, depends on time of the part of the country where you're actually measuring. Again, the distribution remains unequal. And the public power generation capacity was 1,300 megawatts in 2030. It's now In 2017, it went down to 250, which is slightly better now, but the supply to demand gap remains very high. So the political instability started in 2011 with the anti-regime protests coinciding with the Arab Spring. It was resolved relatively soon with the political settlement put forward by Gulf states, the Gulf, and was overseen with by the UN, which practically granted immunity to the former president in return for stepping down. Soon after, a national dialogue conference started. It lasted for almost a year. And with that, so eventually in September 2003, which is an armed group originated in the northernmost part of the country. So basically in 2014, the Houthis stormed the capital, took control of the government or institutions, and then soon after, in March 2015, the Saudi-led coalition bombing campaign started. Next, please. So the current situation now is the Houthis are in control of most of the north of the country. That's the capital city, Sana'a, and other northern areas, whereas the government is in control of the city map and most of the eastern parts of the country. Next, please. So this map basically shows the areas under the control of the government versus the Houthis. And while the government is controlling most of the country, actually most of the population is under the Houthi control. Next, please. So like I mentioned, with the start of the bombing campaign in 2015, the national grid completely collapsed, and its the grid remains until today off of the areas under the Houthi control, whereas it has been reinstituted in some parts of the areas under the government's control. When it first started, there was a severe fuel shortage in all of the country. It lasted also almost for a year. Meanwhile, there was a thriving black market for fuels. Next, please. Infrastructure damage that is substantial. So basically only 10% of transmission infrastructure and 45% of generation distribution units were unaffected. The rest were either completely or partially damaged. Next, please. There's not a fuel, there's not a blockade in the blockade sense of the word, but basically there are import restrictions to areas under the control of the Houthis, and the height of the crisis was actually started in February 2020, where imports coming to Hodeidah port, which is under the control of the Houthis, were decreased by 91%. And in 2018, the coalition put solar panels temporarily on a restricted cargo list, which was eventually removed in early 2019. Next, please. Fuel subsidies before the conflict, they constituted 30 to 37% of state budget. And as a consequence, in the areas under the control of the Houthis, very early on with the crisis, the Houthis removed subsidies completely. Whereas under the government, there has been a partial removal, but for the electricity sector, the subsidies remain. It's okay, okay, go on, no time. So in terms of electricity pricing, it went from 16 Yemeni riyal before the crisis or before the war. In areas under the control of the Houthis, it varies between 240 to 320 riyal per kilowatt hour. That's almost 40 to 53 US cents per kilowatt hour. Whereas areas under the control of the government, the cost has been increased by almost like 60%, which moved from 30 to then to 70 riyal. That's 11 cents per kilowatt hour. Next, please. Private sector is participating in both parts. In the areas under the control of the Houthis, there's a huge increase of micro neighborhoods or diesel generators, just like in the case in Lebanon. And it all started in 2017. And there's almost, just in the capital, there's over 400 diesel generators. They're not as prevalent in areas under the government of the control, but the private sector is also active in the electricity sector, basically by importing fuels and selling it to the government. Next, please. In terms of tax collection, the areas under the control of the Houthis have witnessed improved capabilities of the scope of collection of taxes and of unpaid bills. In fact, some of the people I interviewed within a former staff at the tax authority basically said that they have been able to collect even old unpaid taxes, dues, taxes, and okay. So improved capacities at the Houthi side. And in the government side, the low collection rates remain very low. It used the cumulative unpaid bills before the war was up to 71%. So next, please. Obstruction of aid is mainly happening at the Houthi side, where they have basically established a committee, a council, higher council for aid coordination. And this is completely outside of the state budget. It's not transparent, no one what's going on or what's going on. There's rent seeking both sides. So this is basically, technically is providing, it's paying also for the war efforts, especially at the Houthi side. The UN panel of experts reports has actually estimated the amount of money that the Houthis been able to collect from taxes and from those parallel entities in 2019 alone, up to $1.8 billion. Next, please. In terms of regional and international aid, traditional donors are operating both sides, but in the side of the government, there's the Gulf states, mainly Saudi and UAE, and to some level Qatar before the fallout between Qatar and the rest of the Gulf states, or the UAE and Saudi. So Saudi provides fuel aid directly to the power plants, and the UAE have been supporting salaries and maintenance. There's been also occasional support for power, especially in the summer with the heat. They provide electricity through power ships docking in the port of Aden. Next, please. So with the collapse of the public grid in 2015 to 2017 witnessed the highest level of diffusion of solar PV. Reports are estimating this to up to $1 billion since 2014. In terms of activities in the agriculture sector as well, there's been a lot of use of solar-powered irrigation systems. Next, please. However, there has been a huge decline of demand for solar home systems since 2018. There's been people are saying that a lot of the solar home systems, some people said up to 70% of those purchases have been disused now. And nevertheless, like from people seem to have some sort of a hybrid system. And this is, I'm talking about the northern part of the country where most of the solar diffusion is happening. People use solar panels for certain activities in the house, and then they use commercial or diesel electricity or commercial electricity for other activities. So yeah, can you next, please? So this is basically based on a survey done by the World Bank for willingness to pay. And it shows the main sources of electricity like in the country, like this is a nation wide or representative survey. So 68% use solar panels and 15% use the private grid and 11% use national grid. Nevertheless, again, because of the distribution of the population, where most of the population is concentrated in areas under the Houthis, so this is actually more or less representing more the case in the northern parts of the countries than technically where everywhere is. Next, please. So this is basically showing the use based on areas under control, trying to get that picture a little bit more clear. So like you can see that most of the solar panel use is in areas under control of the Houthis. So is the private grid, and national grid is mostly under areas under the control of the government. The mixed areas are areas where both have control over. There's still some fighting, but they, like for instance, the city of Taiz, where the Houthis are controlling certain parts and the government is controlling other parts. So next, please. So why is this important? Obviously, there's a huge fragmentation of institutions at both sides of the country. There's evolving wartime institutions and a lot of unsustainable also institutional and technological configuration within the sector. And it's important to understand how this is taking place and what are also the basically the, can you next please? I think it's, what are the enabling and blocking mechanism, particularly for the solar PV? As we saw that it was basically most of the diffusion happened when the public grid collapsed and before the commercial grids or diesel grids started appearing. There's a lot of issues with that. People would say that since it's the quality of the solar system that first flooded the market, one of the reasons, but there's also a lot of other promising practices, like how the people are basically dividing their work or their housework load based on source of electricity. So next, please. So basically the next step will be, so this is it. Next step is looking more in depth into the role of actors, different actors into the solar PV system. And for that, I'm using the technological innovation system functions approach, even though it doesn't necessarily address institutional or political economy issues, but this is basically addressed by also using the sort of more institution rebel governance literature framework. Okay, so maybe we can end here. The rest is that's about it.